Hello, very good evening to you and welcome. My name's John Nicholson. I'm a trustee of the Spitalfields Trust, and we've got a treat in store for you tonight because we're talking about a fascinating house in Spitalfields belonging to a fascinating woman called Annetta. So just to give you some context, when I first arrived in Spitalfields in the mid-90s to buy a derelict house, with no electricity, water, or gas, this woman arrived at my door and tapped the door and came in. She spoke with a strong Irish accent. She smoked roll-ups constantly. And I wasn't quite sure whether she was there because she'd taken pity on us because we'd no plumbing, or whether she'd come to inspect us. I think it was probably a bit of both. And she invited us round to her extraordinary house in Princelet Street, a mansion in Princelet Street. And she lived right up at the top in a single room in the attic where she drank copious amounts of tea out of very delicate china cups and smoked those roll-ups and cross-examined us about what our plans were for the future of the building that we'd bought. I think she was worried about the neighborhood changing, and it certainly has changed really out of all recognition ever since. But not Annetta's house. Annetta's house has remained as a timepiece, really one of only two derelict houses left in the neighborhood. But she was determined to transform it, and she wanted to bring it back to life, to the kind of grandeur, I suppose, that we'd once have enjoyed. She collected salvage. She learned to make windows herself so she could put the windows back in the house. But I'm afraid she never really achieved her dream because I don't think it's any secret to say she just didn't have very much money. But she did something wonderful, which was to leave the house to folk that she felt would guarantee its future, who would treasure it, who would repair it, who'd bring it back to life, who'd do all the things that she hadn't been able to do to it, but who wouldn't surrender it to the big developers, as so much of Spitalfields has been surrendered. And on that note, because I'm with the Spitalfields Trust, I'm really keen to point your attention to a battle that's going on at the moment in Woodseer Street, where we're trying to stop some very ugly new developments. So please join the Spitalfields Trust campaign to save Brick Lane. You can find details on the Spitalfields Trust Facebook page and also the Gentle Authors Facebook page as well, Spitalfields Life. But for the next 45 minutes or thereabouts, I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the plans for Annetta's house. And so I'm going to hand over now to Louis from Assemble, and we'll have some questions and answers when Louis finishes speaking. And he asked me to say to you, please, if you could use the chat function to give comments or ask questions. And when Louis finishes in about 40 minutes or thereabouts, I'll try and run through some of the questions that you've posted with him. Over to you, Louis.
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, and thanks so much, everybody, for coming along to the webinar. And thanks very much to the Gentle Author as well for organising it. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by just introducing a bit about who I am and my organisation, Assemble. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues of land and property that I suppose the House of Annetta project is trying to address. And then I'm going to kind of get on and talk about the actual house itself. So I'm going to attempt to share screen. It's a little bit complicated, but here we go. Okay. Okay, so John, is that looking correct to you?
Yes, I've got a building structure with lots of people hanging on to it.
Great, yeah. So this is Assemble, and we are a collective of designers and architects from London. Yeah, this is one of our workspace projects, Yard House. Oops. And yeah, I guess we've been going for about 10 years now, and some of our early work involved kind of these large-scale temporary theatre structures, such as this one in Chichester. And spaces for music and creativity, such as this project for Cafe Otto in Dalston, which we actually worked with the musicians at Cafe Otto to kind of construct the building. So it was done very, very cheaply and using that kind of voluntary labor to construct the space. And, you know, we always bring a sense of kind of craft to our work as well. So do a lot of pottery. This is a experimental toilet that we made with armated shanks, some ceramics. We do exhibitions as well. An exhibition about the Brazilian architect Lina Bobardi, and buildings. Recently, we completed the Goldsmiths Centre for Contemporary Art in New Cross, which was a brand new art gallery for Goldsmiths College. And I guess another thing that's always been part of our work, you know, is being involved in the building process. And what you see on the right-hand side of this slide is a mock-up of the facade that we not only designed, but we also built in our workshop and kind of delivered to site. And another major part of our work is really setting up organizations with social purpose. So this is Black Horse Workshop, which some of you may know, in North London, and it's an open access workshop. The idea is it's a kind of library for tools, where people can come and use woodworking and metalworking equipment that, you know, you could never ever fit in your garden shed. And, you know, and it's a social space as well, but we, you know, we set that up from scratch. You know, we kind of had the idea and we worked with the local council. We set it up as a company, we recruited the staff, and we kind of organized the whole thing. And I think that's because we feel like architecture is about much more than designing buildings. You know, it's about what happens inside the buildings. It's about what happens in the city. And we've done that, you know, a number of times. And this is a community fashion school that we set up in New Orleans a couple of years ago, using which was a kind of philanthropic investment. So that's a little bit about us. So I am now going to talk a little bit about land. So I want to start with a quote from a novel by Kurt Vonnegut called Breakfast of Champions. In the quote, he's talking about a science fiction writer called Kilgore Trout, who's one of the main characters in the novel. Kilgore Trout once wrote a story called This Means You. It was set in the Hawaiian Islands, the place where the lucky winners of Dwayne Hoover's contest in Midland City were supposed to go. Every bit of land on the islands was owned by about 40 people. And in the story, Trout had those people decide to exercise their property rights to the full. They put up no trespassing signs on everything. This created terrible problems for the million other people on the islands. The law of gravity required that they stick somewhere on the surface. Either that, or they could go out into the water and bob offshore. But then the federal government came through with an emergency program. It gave a big balloon full of helium to every man, woman, and child who didn't own property. There was a cable with a harness on it dangling from each balloon. With the help of the balloons, Hawaiians could go on inhabiting the islands without always sticking to things other people owned. So throughout history, people have spoken about the unfair ability of landowners to extract value. True comrades such as Winston Churchill and classical economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo, for example. The Scottish economist Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, one of the key founding texts of classical economics favored by the political right. But here's what he had to say about land. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent even for its natural produce. Smith is saying that it's an injustice to seek rent on the natural produce of land, because that is something which the landlord has neither labored nor invested to produce. Smith also thought that economic growth is dependent on three factors: labor, capital, and land. Smith confers such status on land over and above other things because, like Vonnegut, he understands that the law of gravity requires people to be on land the vast majority of the time, and therefore there is always a requirement for it. It says something about the state of the modern discipline of political economy, that in many textbooks, land has been replaced as a factor of production by entrepreneurship. The diminishment of the importance of land says something about how people think. In the modern world, it's all too easy to forget that the other factors of production, capital and labor, are actually created out of the physical substance of the land. The general term land could also be called the planet. And whether it be a computer, a person, a cow, or a bicycle, every single atom of those things is created from the land, from the planet. This is not to mention the political act of circumscribing land, portioning it, parceling it off to various people, and enforcing their control over it with violence. What about Winston Churchill? Here's what he has to say. The landlord who happens to own a plot of land on the outskirts of a great city watches the busy population around him making the city larger, richer, more convenient, and all the while sits and does nothing. Roads are made, services are improved, water is brought from reservoirs 100 miles off in the mountains, and all the while the landlord sits still. To not one of these improvements does the landlord monopolist contribute, and yet by every one of them, the value of his land is enhanced. At last, the land becomes ripe for sale. That means the price is too tempting to be resisted any longer. In fact, you may say that the unearned increment is reaped by the land monopolist in exact proportion, not to the service, but to the disservice done. The late professor of anthropology, David Graeber, in his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, explains the ability of the warrior classes through control of land and debt to enslave people in many countries over centuries. He discusses one of these situations in the Eastern Himalayas from the French anthropologist Jean-Claude Gailly. So he says, as recently as the 1970s, there was a situation where the low-ranking castes, they were referred to as the vanquished ones, since they were thought to be descended from a population once conquered by the current landlord caste many centuries before, lived in a situation of permanent debt dependency. Landless and penniless, they were obliged to solicit loans from the landlords simply to find a way to eat. Not for the money, since the sums were paltry, but because poor debtors were expected to pay back the interest in the form of work, which meant they were at least provided with food and shelter while they cleaned out their creditors' outhouses and re-roofed their sheds. For the vanquished, as for most people in the world actually, the most significant life expenses were weddings and funerals. These required a good deal of money, which always had to be borrowed. In such cases, it was common practice, Gailey explains, for high caste moneylenders to demand one of the borrower's daughters as security. Often, when a poor man had to borrow money for his daughter's marriage, the security would be the bride herself. She would be expected to report to the lender's household after her wedding night, spend a few months there as his concubine, and then, once he grew bored, be sent off to some nearby timber camp, where she would have to spend the next year or two working as a prostitute to pay off her father's debt. Once accounts were settled, she could return to her husband and begin married life. This seems shocking, outrageous even, but Gailey does not report any widespread feeling of injustice. Everyone seemed to feel that this was just the way things worked. The last point is interesting. How much do we see things as just the way they work? It may be unflattering to compare ourselves to landless and penniless peasants, but we currently live in a country in which around 50% of the population own virtually nothing at all. When you own nothing, you still need a roof over your head, and many people in this position will pay their rent to a wealthy landlord. Increasing the landlord's wealth, but at the same time have a job earning money by servicing the needs of the wealthy. Grosvenor are a British aristocratic family that are currently the largest landlord in the UK. The late Gerald Grosvenor, former Duke of Westminster and heir to the Grosvenor fortune, was once asked what advice he'd give to young entrepreneurs keen to emulate his success. He said, "Make sure that they have an ancestor who was a very close friend of William the Conqueror." And he meant that literally. It's interesting that this kind of situation, where some people are granted at birth the rights to control vast amounts of money, money which is used to directly control other people, is seen as completely normal. In his book, Capital and Ideology, Thomas Piketty explains the situation as the British and French governments attempted to end slavery in their colonies. The issue they had was that the slave owners had bought the slaves legally, so it was inconceivable that they wouldn't be compensated for these assets that would now be removed from their balance sheets. Huge loans were taken out to pay off the slave owners, essentially to purchase the freedom of the slaves. It was never considered that the slaves themselves might be compensated because they weren't being deprived of anything. Apparently, Lincoln fought the Civil War because the government simply could not afford to buy out the slave owners, though that would have been an easier solution. On the question and answer site, Quora, somebody asked, why does the Duke of Westminster own so much land and property? Why can't he be forced to sell some of it? So the answers are quite revealing about how we think about inherited wealth. I'm just going to share my screen again. So why does the Duke of Westminster own so much land and property? Why can't he be forced to sell most of it? So here's one. This is kind of like the main answer, but then there were a few answers along these lines. The Duke of Westminster was a Victorian title, but the land is called the Grosvenor Estate. It came into the family by marriage in 1677. Blah, blah, blah. The current value of the land has much to do with how the Grosvenor family took risks to develop it, and some good luck too. The family spent a lot of money building Grosvenor Square and Mayfair as a speculative real estate investment. There was no guarantee the property would sell well or at all, but it did. There is nothing, blah, blah, blah. There is nothing shady or illegal about this. So I'm not sure why you feel they should be forced to sell it. What crime have they committed that would justify the extreme measure of property seizure? Well, here's another answer. Possibly because Britain is not a communist country. Once you start setting up a system that decrees that people may not own private property beyond a certain level, then all private ownership is potentially subject to confiscation. It's only a matter of degree. Or another one. That family has been building the estate for centuries, all perfectly legally and paying all their required taxes. They sold property on 99-year leases so that the property would eventually return to their great-grandchildren. That's called long-term inheritance planning. Nobody was forced to take such a lease. They knew what they were buying. As soon as you start saying the state is entitled to steal legally held property from someone who's not committed a crime, you're on a very slippery slope. So, and then maybe one of the better answers, as the Duke himself said, most of the aristocracy in Britain got to be that way through being brutal and cruel. Over the centuries, they took what they wanted by force. We didn't have a revolution as they did in France, so the status quo continues to this day. It is an unequal and unfair state of affairs, but we seem to put up with it. More fool us. And of course, private property is regularly subject to seizure. It's called taxation. And, you know, Grosvenor's lands were originally taken by the sword. And I think in many ways, the situation is similar to that mentioned in David Graeber's story. We can't imagine the situation being any different, despite the fact that we also cannot imagine a reason why, in all fairness, the Duke of Westminster should own and control the land. But not only is it unfair that Hugh Grosvenor, the current Duke of Westminster, owns vast swathes of London and other lands purely by birthright, it also serves no purpose whatsoever to society other than ensuring the stability of the ruling class. It's not a socialist ideal, but neither is it a capitalist or meritocratic ideal. And we live in a world where inequality is increasing. The proportion of all things that are currently owned by the top 10% and the top 1% of society is increasing around the world. And there is currently no reason to think that will stop. So I just encourage you to think about, what about the people who built the buildings for Grosvenor? What about the peoples whose lands were conquered by them? What about the foot soldiers on both sides? What about the people that currently clean, secure, and work in Grosvenor's buildings? And I guess the wider question of who should control buildings and land. In more recent history, unfairness around access to land, especially access to housing, is a well-known issue that many movements have tried to address over the years. So the Building Society movement, Victorian philanthropy, nationalisation of housing provision after World War II, the Housing Association movement, and the Town and Country Planning Act, which effectively nationalised planning. Regeneration as a concept in the UK traces its genealogy back to the slum clearances of the Victorian era. The Boundary Estate was famously the first council estate, and it was one of the first instances of inner city regeneration in the current mould. It was built by the Metropolitan Board of Works. The MWB was set up by statute and funded by central government, but was tasked with the construction of large infrastructure projects in the city, including sewers, bridges, and parks. In general, the MWB's purpose was to improve the health of the population. The social housing of the post-war era, in many cases, was also seen as replacing housing which was bad for people's health. For example, the block that my dad lives in up in Hoxton was officially opened by Nye Bevan, Minister of Health. Bevan oversaw the inauguration of the NHS, and he saw council housing as providing the same service for clean, decent housing as the NHS does for healthcare. The comparison with the NHS is important because today we understand that healthcare should be provided by the state, because if it was provided privately, it would be grossly unfair. However, we've forgotten that other aspect, the fact that we're all subject to the law of gravity, and therefore rich or poor are entitled to some dignity whilst down here. Sorry, I'm just reading the text. I'll just rifle through this stuff. The nationalization of housing provision and the construction of large amounts of social housing controlled by the state after World War II was a huge victory. As we know, it wasn't to last. This opportunity, which had only come about due to the partial and random destruction of the city by the Luftwaffe, was something that was not just a once in a lifetime opportunity. It was a kind of destruction that had not been seen since the Great Fire. It was once in a 4 centuries opportunity. And the sad thing is, the opportunity was taken, but then this victory turned virtually to dust in the 80s and 90s with Right to Buy. Sorry, I'm coming on to Annetta's house. I maybe wrote something a little bit long, but basically what I'm trying to say is that you know, what we have at the moment is a very unfair situation, and it's not just housing. It's you know, the pressure on housing is pressure on puts pressure on other forms of land use as well, and that makes life very, very difficult. Anyway, we're running out of time, so I will get on to the main part of the presentation. Okay. So this is the house of Annetta. And it's at number 25 Princelet Street in Spitalfields. In a house that was built in 1705, and it was one of the first houses that was built on the street. It's a 5-story building, double fronted, is big. This image is from, I think, the 1950s, when the building would more than likely have been split up into at least six flats, 1 room per family. And some of those would have been, may have also been workshops as well, as was very common in the area. So here's the location. It's right next to Brick Lane, and it's also got a little yard in the back. And as John mentioned, it was most recently occupied by this amazing woman called Annetta Pedretti, who I never met, but we have subsequently learned a lot about her by basically looking through her stuff in the house. And this is what it looks like at the moment. As John said, you know, she was working on this refurbishment project, but, you know, it was really a case of much done, but much still to do. She replaced all of the windows and repointed the whole back of the house. But, you know, most of the house was just left in this state in which she had stripped back the modern finishes, and just left it like that. And so this is the state that we found it in. And it was also it was full of her stuff. You know, this this is actually, you know, tidied up. We spent a long time kind of tidying up her stuff and going through it. But she had an amazing range of interests. You know, she was a beekeeper. She had an allotment in Enfield, and she built these amazing structures. And she studied architecture at the AA, but she also had a PhD in cybernetics, and she was printing. She had a printing press, and she was printing books on cybernetics from the house, and she was applying cybernetic principles to beekeeping, and the fact that everything is kind of stripped back gives you this amazing kind of view of, you know, these old processes, you know, this lime mortar with horsehair mortar and things like that, which is quite amazing. You know, Annetta was clearly one of those people who would be kind of obsessively interested in something, you know, but never quite finish it. And that seemed to be true for a lot of her building projects, you know, on the house, or little projects on the house. So she must have spent a really long time making all these spindles for the staircase, but then she, you know, didn't finish it, didn't actually get very far. But yeah, replacing the windows. And, you know, making all of the, on the left, you see like she's making all of these amazing panels, you know, because the houses when they originally built would have been all wood paneled. And so, but she's adding this kind of like decorative marquetry, which is using two different woods and like cutting out all these kind of patterns. But, you know, spending ages, you know, making these things and like kind of, but never getting to the point where she can actually finish it. But yeah, some things she did manage to do that, you know, she worked with a guy to kind of replace these scrolls on the door. And yeah, this is some of her work, you know, with the printing press. She printed with Princelet editions. There's at least, you know, 30 or 40 different publications. In the 80s and 90s, she was very much involved in the cybernetics scene, and she printed books that she had written on the cybernetics of language, as well as, you know, books on conferences and by other cyberneticists. But it seemed like in the kind of mid-90s, she became a bit estranged from that scene, and became more and more reclusive. She's got a lot of computers as well, you know, like a lot of cyberneticists, she was involved in kind of early computing stuff. Some of her honey. She had tons of videos. There's loads of stuff, you know, that we haven't even looked at yet. There's all these videos, all these cassette tapes. You know, most of these videos are a long form project called Horizon. We're not really sure what that is. There's a kind of process of archiving her stuff that's yet to come. She had a lovely project designing flags. She kind of designed this methodology for designing flags that represent no nation, or like multicultural flags. And we still got all of these flags as well that she's sewn up, you know. She made clothes as well. She's got these amazing clothes that have kind of feminist slogans on them. But she was also, you know, she was also really interested in this issue of privatization of property, and some of her work reflects that as well. And she was very political. You she was a real feminist, as can be seen from a lot of her, the publications that she had in the house. And she was a local campaigner as well. We found these amazing kind of handmade petition to save Whitechapel Baths, which unfortunately was not successful. But she was very much involved in that. And she was also involved in the Crossrail hole. The Crossrail tunnel actually runs directly below 25 Princelet Street. They were going to put a shaft next to Second Home, like next to Banglatown. But there was a local campaign. Eventually that idea was scrapped, and she was very much involved in that. And actually, she went to the House of Lords to discuss it. And what was quite interesting is that in the minutes, she says that the only reason why she was allowed to come and speak at the House of Lords was that she was the owner of private property above the train tunnels. And she saw this as a great injustice. And so now we're working in residence in the house as far as is possible, COVID permitting. We're working to turn the house into a centre for land reform and housing justice. What exactly that's going to look like remains to be seen, because we want to use our residency as a process for bringing people into the house, to start to think about what that could look like. And also, we don't have the money to do it either. So we need to raise a lot of money to kind of make the building habitable. And we worked with the Gentle Author and Spitalfields Trust to put on an exhibition about the brewery. And that also gave us an opportunity to kind of start making the ground floor safe, and so we can now kind of open that up. We've got the exhibition in there at the moment, but we can kind of open that up for more public uses to start this discussion about what this centre might look like. And yeah, we've got the banners out as well. We're very much involved and supportive of the Spitalfields Trust's campaign against the development. So this is where we're at the moment, basically. And I'd just like to mention briefly as well that the reason why we're there is because Annetta was Swiss Italian, and she actually died without a will, and her family left the house to charity, and the charity they left it to is called the Edith Marion Foundation, or Stiftung Edith Marion, which is based in Switzerland. And what they do is they take land and property off the market, so that it's kind of out of the flow of speculation and inheritance. And they own a large number of properties, mostly in Switzerland and Germany, but they own all sorts of property like farms, shopping centres, housing estates, and they basically try to, if those properties don't have established uses, try to set up projects that have a social purpose. But you can see they don't own any properties in the UK. So 25 Princelet Street is their first property in the UK. And they asked us to have a look at it and work out what to do with it. So that's kind of where we're at. And don't forget to put in your objection to the planning application for the Truman Brewery development. Information is on this slide. For me personally, it's not so much the idea of the development itself, but it's the process by which these things happen, you know, in which it's the landowner who proposes something, and, you know, the local community, all they can do is react, you know, and then, and it's very, very difficult to come up with an alternative proposal, because that requires a lot of resources. And if you're not going to benefit, you know, if you're not going to make money out of it, it's difficult to find the money to kind of to make a proposal like that, because you need, you know, professional input. So please make your objection. Yeah, that's the end. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Louis, and so many very interesting themes that you've touched on throughout the whole of that talk. I should, you know, you've been very incredibly modest. It's worth telling everybody watching this that your collective won the Turner Prize. So, you know, they're a very impressive and interesting group of people who are in charge of this house. I was very interested in a whole variety of the themes that you mentioned. You mentioned the Boundary Estate nearby, which of course is very beautiful as an example of fabulous inner city urban planning. But it's worth noting that all the people who were cleared from the slums previously in order to build the Boundary Estate, none of them could afford to pay the prices that the council then charged to move into those houses. So it's often cited as an example of wonderful Victorian urban planning, but actually it was immensely cruel. It cleared people out and they couldn't afford to move back into the area where they'd lived.
Well, then it's fitting. Sorry,
I was going to say I belong to the first generation of my family to own a house. So I'm interested in this whole area of this whole issue of house ownership. My family come from the Outer Hebrides, where people were cleared incredibly brutally from their land. The Duke of Westminster has done pretty well. The Duke of Sutherland did incredibly well as well. And there's a little tiny bit of civil disobedience that the folk who erected his massive statue in Sutherland, after the incredible brutality and cruelty and murder committed by his family, they erected a statue, the workers who erected a statue erected it back to front, just as a little bit of posthumous shame for him. I want to talk a wee bit with you about Annetta, because I noticed that most of the comments that we're getting are about Annetta, and a lot of people want to talk about Annetta. And I, unlike you, I did know her. I don't pretend to know her well, but I spent many, many hours in her company. And I think it's very important not to romanticize Annetta's life, because she died in extreme poverty. I imagine immensely lonely, and with her life's project unaccomplished, because what she wanted to do with that house, because she told me, was she wanted to restore it to its Georgian beauty. And she was a purist, she was an architect, she loved architecture. And she studied at night class to make those windows, and you saw her doing a bit of beautiful line pointing. She didn't want that house to look the way that it did. And lots of people can be overly romantic about Spitalfields in its squalor and poverty.
Mm.
Don't think she wanted anything fancy schmancy, and she certainly didn't want it to pass into the hands of wealthy bankers and sell for millions and millions of pounds. She definitely wanted that house to be restored. How are you going to go about restoring it and getting it to look the way Annetta wanted it to look as a properly restored Georgian house? You're an architect. How are you going to do it?
Well, it's going to be difficult. I mean, we need to raise, maybe £1.5 million, and that's money that we don't have.
Why do you think it'll cost that? I've restored a derelict house. My house was in exactly the same condition as Annetta's, smaller, but it was in exactly the same condition. I can tell you it didn't cost £1.5 million to restore or anything like that. I'm a journalist by profession, although I'm now an MP, but I'm a journalist by profession, and I just didn't earn the kind of money that would have allowed me to spend that. I did it bit by bit, and it doesn't cost anything like that.
Yeah, I mean that's just the kind of professional cost advice that we've received. So obviously we just have to we have to take that as written.
I think you should talk to the Spitalfields Trust, who've restored a lot of buildings and have a great deal of expertise, and they're folk who provide their time for nothing. And I guess they'd want to help you with. Well, I know you are talking to them, but I think they'd want to help, because you guys are you guys have got the design and craftsmanship skills. So
yeah, I mean, it's at the moment, we're not focusing on the main kind of refurbishment project. We're focusing on the building it as a project, building the coalition of people who are going to use it, and that's what we're doing at the moment, rather than looking at the kind of detailed design project.
Christina has just sent a message. I don't know if you saw it there, but she said, I've got lots of professional contacts, and I think she's offering volunteers to help to complete the project. On your other points that you made, I mean, you talked about the selling off of council housing, which I'm totally with you. I was always appalled with the way the Labour Party supported this. I'm an SNP MP, and my own party got rid of council house sales, because inevitably what it did was rob inner cities of the housing stock without replacing it with anything. So I always thought it was terrible the way all the political parties were so frightened of the tabloids over that they coalesced around this idea that you sell off the crown jewels, as Harold Macmillan called it. But one of the problems, and we've been talking about Woodseer Street, and a week ago today, I chaired a discussion about all the huge projects where local people have been overruled in Spitalfields, not least the Fruit and Wool Exchange. The Labour Party gave the Mayor of London the power to overrule the local authorities, and Boris Johnson misused that to an incredible degree to trample over the wishes of local people, and over the local councils as well. And it was intended to free up big grand projects so they couldn't be held back by NIMBYism, but instead it was used to support to support developers against local people where they wanted to preserve areas of the city. I mean, how do you think people can overturn that? Because there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of political will from either of the big parties to allow that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult, and I think in general, I think, like I kind of alluded to, I think there's major issues with the way that development decisions about development are made. And the main issue is that the only people who really can come up with ideas are private developers. You know, if you're part of a local community and you have an idea for, you know, an area or a building or whatever, then you can't just come up with, you know, technically anyone can apply for planning permission on any building at any time. But the kind of resources that you need and the time that you need to spend on doing that is really just outside of the reach of people.
Well, the fruit and wool exchange was an absolute classic case because the local people opposed it. We managed to persuade the council to refuse planning permission, despite the fact that planning officers, as so often, side with the big developers. The Spitalfields Trust came up with a whole set of plans which would have allowed small businesses to occupy the space. It would have saved Dorset Street in the middle. It would have allowed low-cost public housing and local businesses. And Boris Johnson, as Mayor of London, came up on his bike one day. I saw him turning the map upside down. I was there because he was so unfamiliar with the area. He went into the building, stood on the roof for 10 minutes, spoke to the developers, then went back to City Hall. And I was asked by the local people to speak on behalf of them to save the building. And you can imagine his shock to see an SNP MP standing in front of him talking about a building in London. And he spent a couple of minutes and then he sided with the developers against the local people and against the council. And now we have a monstrosity with a front facade, the inside of the building demolished, the amazing basement where the market porters sheltered during the Second World War and drew graffiti all over the walls, all smashed down. The shops can't be rented, they're lying empty. In the post-COVID world, the offices are going to lie empty and all that history gone and the opportunity for something better gone. So I want to, because I know you're keen to stress this as well as the Spitalfields Trust and gentle author, Woodseer Street development is vile. It's corporate, it's wrong for the post-COVID world. It replaces what was once modest housing with a huge big set of glass boxes. Again, they want to rent out to chains. There'll be no local shops and no local housing. And it's another monstrosity.
Well, I mean, this is why, you know, this is the kind of reason for the House of Annetta project, is to try to bring together, you know, a coalition of, you know, there's people who are thinking about this. There's campaigns all over London, you know, there's the Spitalfields Trust, but there's, you know, the Seven Sisters campaign, for example, the Haygate campaign, you know, there's the Elephant and Castle campaign. There's all these campaign groups, but they're very disparate. And bringing them together in a place where there's also maybe people who are thinking about the more intellectual aspects of things. Maybe we have a PhD student there who, you know, is doing their thesis on fairer ways of developing and sharing land. And we have a library, and, you know, we have access to information. And I think that's the point of it, is to try to bring together a lot of different people to make something that can kind of share ideas. I'm watching lots of people posting messages. Bridget says, in response to something you said earlier on about us not having a revolution, she said, we did have a revolution. I think she's probably referring to the glorious revolution of 1688, though I think you could argue that was, you could certainly make a case that was an anti-Catholic revolution, and it certainly didn't result in any
any radical changes. A lot of people, Louis, are asking how they can come and see, because a lot of the folk here, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of sympathy for the political points that you're making, but there's a lot of architecture buffs listening to this. They want to go and see Annetta's house and find out more about Annetta as well. How can they visit?
The best thing to do is there is a. Oh, Bridget says no. She's talking about the
execution of Charles I.
Okay, yeah. The thing is, just to quickly respond to that point, is that in France, I think I was maybe when I said that, I think I was quoting someone, but I think the point is that in France that they sought to dismantle the old structures of the ancient regime, and they did that very, very carefully. Whereas in England and in the UK, you know, those aristocratic kind of titles, really, a lot of them remained. I'm not an expert on the history, but yeah, my understanding of it was that in the in the French Revolution, it was a bit.
Arthur suggested bringing back the guillotine, perhaps for one day only. There's no shortage of people, I think, who would be up for the job. Listen, if people want to come and see Annetta's house and find out more about Annetta, how can they get into this wonderful house and have a tour?
Yeah, I mean, follow us on Instagram at House Annetta. If people want to put their email address in a direct message to me, I will add you to our mailing list as well, so that you can keep up to date. The plan at the moment is to reopen the house and reopen the exhibition on the 17th of May. But you know, watch out for our messages. We'll update people. Just put your email address in the chat. Follow us on Instagram, and we'll keep you updated. We're there quite often as well, so if you're in the area, pop round, and I'm always happy to show people around. It is an amazing, magical place.
It is an amazing, magical place, and she was a remarkable woman, and I'm so glad that her legacy is going to be remembered, and that she's going to be remembered. As I said at the start of the talk, for people who haven't been here since the beginning, I remember her chapping on my door when I bought my own derelict house, and I remember her kindness and her engagement. I her husky Irish accent, which is a mystery given that she was Swiss, and I remember her passion for social justice and her passion for her beautiful house that she wanted to see restored and never quite managed to do. Please, if you want to stop the development of the awful development of Woodseer Street, because it's too small for the Mayor of London to intervene and to cancel out local wishes, this really is a chance to stop inappropriate development, because it's too small for the Mayor of London to use his powers to override the locals. So it's all a question of what the London Borough of Tower Hamlets does, and we really can influence them. So please follow the Spitalfields Trust, who have links to how you can complain about Woodseer Street development, and the gentle author Spitalfields Life, who is hosted this evening, set this evening up as well. So you can also follow him. It's a fantastic website anyway, and blog, so well worth following. Anyway, lots and lots of people sending you questions, and I hope you can be able to answer them, Louis. And I'd like to thank you personally for coming along and talking to us this evening. Belated congratulations on the Turner Prize. I know I think I'm about 6 years too late, but it's been lovely to meet you. We promised people an hour's talk. The hour is up. So
can I? Yeah,
of course.
Thanks very much. Just wanted to say, you know, we need your help. You know, we need people's help. So please do give me your email address in the chat, and you know, come round. We welcome people around the house. We want people to know about it. We want people to see it, especially because it's not going to be in this state forever. Just give us your input, you know, and let us know how you can help, or how we can help you with the project. So
that's brilliant. Louis, thank you very much indeed. Louis is from Assemble, and we've been talking about Annetta's house in Spitalfields. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and good night.
Thank you.